Hey, gang. Let's see, get my little laser pointer. Okay, this is me and Mr. Bones talking about trees again. Trees Part 2. Part 1 was kind of full of like technical information and tree anatomy and maybe a little dry. This is just some weird trees, just some cool, freaky trees. We're going to talk about just kind of how amazing they are and look at some of my favorite trees. And then we're going to get into some really weird terrain at the very end of the video and talk about immortality in organisms. Whoa, okay, stay tuned. Okay, here's some truffula trees from the Lorax. That's a great book. If you have never read it, got to read the Lorax. Cautionary tale. Very weird tree, truffula tree. Okay, now this is a rainbow eucalyptus. I was trying to think of what tree Dr. Seuss was maybe thinking of when he made the truffula tree, and I thought, must have been a rainbow eucalyptus that he was basing the truffula on. And look at this stuff. This bark is really beautiful. It kind of starts off reddish, brownish, and then as it sort of dies and dries and flakes off, it reveals this beautiful green wood underneath. And that green wood slowly over time becomes brown, then red, then orange, then yellow, and it flakes off again. And it happens at kind of different times. And so it gets this beautiful rainbow pattern on the trunk of the tree. And it's called rainbow eucalyptus. There's a bunch of them together. They look really pretty after it rains. It really brings out the colors. Now around here we have the madrona, and it has similar bark. It kind of has this flaky, peely bark that when it comes off, it's this beautiful green, smooth bark underneath. And then slowly over time, that green bark turns brown and dries out, and it peels off and reveals that beautiful, smooth green bark underneath. Here's a big tree of it here. Sometimes they have multiple stems or stalks or boles. That's what they're called. The trunks are called boles. Big, beautiful tree. They have red berries that the birds really love. They're very important trees around here. And this is kind of sad. This is this giant madrona that was on 8th Street, right as you're going across the bridges on 8th Street. There's a little daycare right here, like a preschool daycare on the corner. It used to be called Bo Baggins. But this was the 4th largest madrona in the state of Washington. It was super old, and it recently died, basically. And here's some guys cutting off the limbs. This happened last December, I think. And here's these big chunks lying on the streets, and they're raking up all the big mess. And so now it looks like it looks about like this. If you're ever driving past 8th Street, it looks like, yeah, it's kind of crazy looking. But the people that own the property are talking about maybe building a treehouse in it, which would be super cool. The kids from the daycare could go and hang out and maybe have class up in the treehouse. We'll see if it happens. It's probably kind of a long shot, but still a neat idea. But anyways, R.I.P. Giant Madrona. Okay. Now here's another weird tree, the baobab. The baobab is only found in Madagascar. It is an island off the coast of Africa. Do I got a map in here? Yeah, here we go. Here's Madagascar. Some of you have maybe seen the movie Madagascar, where those zoo animals crash land their plane. That's where they crashed, on this big, big island off the coast of Africa. Anyways, Madagascar has a bunch of weird plants and animals, and this is one of those weird plants. Look at how big that trunk is, that bowl. And that's because those things can store a bunch of water, and these trees can survive during extreme droughts. Like it might not rain for a year or more, and these trees can survive because they've got up to 32,000 gallons of water stored in those trunks. That's about our classroom filled up with water. That's how much water they can store in those big trunks. And here's a beautiful silhouetted shot of those baobabs the sunset going on over there. Oh, and they don't grow tree rings. Some trees that grow around the equator or in very hot spots or places that have not a lot of moisture or experience a lot of drought, a lot of those trees don't grow tree rings. So it's hard to age them. Like cactus and stuff don't grow tree rings. And there's Madagascar. Here's another awesome photo of these baobabs. Just such awesome. Really, like not very many branches. And they're big, thick branches. And yeah, just a little bit of leaves at the very top. Okay. Now, I wanted to introduce a couple of concepts here. We're going to talk about like the biggest tree in the world. And the oldest tree in the world. And I'm going to talk about how those are kind of complicated questions, really. They might sound kind of straightforward and simple, but really there's some exceptions to these ideas of oldest and biggest. And we're going to talk a little bit about that here at the end. So here's this piece of coral. This coral colony is over 2,000 years old. And it might be way older than that. It's hard for us to really study these things sometimes, but this is a super old, big chunk of coral here. And this is a super big tree. Some would say it's the biggest tree in the world. Some would say it's the biggest organism in the world. We talked about how blue whales are the biggest animal that's ever existed. Well, this is the biggest tree that's ever existed. Close to 3 million pounds. It's a sequoia. It grows down in California. But it's not really the biggest tree in the world. It's the biggest, single trunk tree in the world. Okay, let's say that. It's the biggest single trunk tree in the world. This is technically the biggest tree in the world. And you might say, hey, wait a minute. That's not one tree. That's a bunch of trees. That's like 40,000 trees all put together. All these yellow trees are quaking aspens, and they are technically the same tree. Okay, what does that mean? It means that they're all clones of one another. Okay, they're all the exact same genetic, identical twins. Not twins. There are 40,000 of them, not two of them. Okay, so not only is this the biggest tree in the world, it is the oldest tree in the world. It's the oldest anything in the world because scientists have figured that 80,000 years ago is when the first tree in Pando, this thing's called Pando, it's in Oregon. The first tree of Pando popped up 80,000 years ago. And then a little clone popped up next to it. It clones itself through its roots. Basically, its roots go along the ground, and a little sprout comes out of the roots next to the original tree. And it kept doing that until it was acres and acres big, 40,000 trees, and this all started 80,000 years ago. So the initial tree in Pando has been dead a really long time, but technically it's still alive. And technically, this is all one tree, even though it's this massive forest. Oh, and it's 13 million pounds, much bigger than 3 million pounds of the giant sequoia we were looking at before. So this question of the biggest tree in the world, it's kind of complicated. You have to specify what you're talking about. Are you talking about one single trunk tree? Oh, that's this giant sequoia in California. Or are you talking about just the biggest organism in the world, counting all clones and stuff? Then you're talking about Pando, the biggest and the oldest. Wait, is it really the oldest thing in the world? It's the oldest tree in the world. But is it the oldest organism in the world? Well, there's this bristlecone pine. This thing is 5,000 years old. Okay, not nearly as old as 80,000. But this, as far as like a single trunked tree, is the oldest tree in the world. Okay? It's much, much older than any other single trunk tree in the world. We have some trees around here that can grow to be about 2,000 years old, very old, and certainly the oldest thing around here in terms of trees. This is a yellow cedar. This one is down in the rainforest out by Forks. It's over 2,000 years old, super old. Not nearly as old as this thing. This thing is over 5,000 years old. It lives up in the mountains in California and Nevada in these really harsh environments. So it's like not very big. Look at this big cedar. This thing's massive. It's hundreds of feet tall. This thing is like 20 feet tall. It grows very little every year, but it's been around since basically the pyramids were built, or before that even. Even the needles on these trees can be 40 years old, which is insanely old. Like a lot of times needles on trees are just maybe a year or two old. These needles on these trees can be 40 years old. Pretty wild. Okay, so yeah, 5,000 years old. That's pretty old. Not nearly as old as 80,000 years old, but for a single trunked tree, the bristlecone pine, this is a bristlecone pine, is the oldest single trunked tree on the planet. Okay, here's some super old stuff. We talked about those corals earlier that were 2,000 years old. These sponges down in the Antarctic are 15,000 years old, we think. It's hard to age these things. That's our best guess. That's what scientists have said. But these things, very, very slow growing in extremely cold water, and they think they're about 15,000 years old. Totally awesome. Okay, is that the oldest thing in the ocean? Well, it has to be 15,000 years old. I mean, that's insane. There's nothing else even close to that, right? Wrong again. It seems like there's always an exception in nature. Every time we try to like put something in a nice, neat, tidy little box, something like the immortal jellyfish comes swimming along and ruins all of our big ideas. Okay, so theoretically, hypothetically, this species of jellyfish never dies. So what that means, since jellyfish have been around for millions and millions of years, that jellyfish that we're looking at right there could actually be millions of years old. Okay, how does this even exist? How does this work? Okay, here's the life cycle of the jellyfish over here in the corner, okay? And basically what happens is, if we start with how jellyfish first get their start is, there are these things called polyps. They look like little trees that are on, attached to a rock or something like that, stuck on the bottom of the ocean. And these little trees have little flowers that looks like on the ends of them. And those are baby jellyfish that eventually just like pop off and they float away. And those little things that pop off and float away are baby jellyfish. And they grow up into a medusa. This is called a medusa, and it's what we think of when we think of jellyfish. Scientists call it a medusa. It's a phase in the jellyfish's life cycle. So now usually what happens with these medusas is they produce eggs, they make babies, and those babies kind of swim around in the water for a while, but eventually they settle down to the ground in the ocean and they sprout up like those little polyps that started the cycle, okay? And the whole thing starts over again. Okay, with the immortal jellyfish, when these medusas get really old and they can't really live anymore, and most jellyfish would just die at that point, these immortal jellyfish, they sink down to the bottom. They look like they're dead. They stop flapping their little tentacles. They just are this ball of cells on the bottom of the ocean. And that ball of cells, instead of being dead and just being absorbed into the, whatever life is around it, eaten by bacteria, or a fish comes along and chews on it, these little ball of cells on the bottom of the ocean sprout up those little polyps again. And out of those little polyps, the baby jellyfish start sprouting off and start floating away into the water. And in that way, the immortal jellyfish continues its life cycle and it starts all over again. And hypothetically, theoretically, these things have been around for millions of years. One individual has been around for millions of years. We don't know that, obviously. We've only been doing science for a little while. They've got these now in aquariums and they're studying how they do their thing. But it looks like it's just possible. It might be possible that these things live for extremely long periods of time, way older than 80,000 years. Remember, we thought Pando was the oldest thing ever, those bunch of trees lived to be 80,000 years. The immortal jellyfish could be millions of years old. Whew, okay, guys. Kind of a weird episode. Started with trees, ended up talking about jellyfish, but, sometimes we just got to go with science and see where the rabbit hole leads us. Okay, well, thanks for watching, Wolves. Me and Mr. Bones will see you next time. Ow!